Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Van Eyten. I'm from the Department of Philosophy and also associated with the administration of the College of Sciences and Humanities. On behalf of the faculty and students and administrators who are associated with Iowa State University's Religious Studies program, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 4th Annual Conference on Religious Ethics and Technological Change. Today's program is sponsored by a number of local agencies: the College of Agriculture, the Department of Economics, the Committee on Lectures at Iowa State, the Program in Religious Studies, and the Department of Philosophy. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, Gary Comstock, and his respondent, a friend of ours, Lauren Soth, I'd like to make just a few remarks to place the conference in what I understand its historical context to be. Land-grant legislation in providing for the formation of people's colleges introduced to our society the conception of colleges and universities as agents of social change. That's my view, whether they intended it or not. As soon as you band together to organize for the discovery and dissemination of knowledge, that's what's going to happen. By focusing talents and resources, legislators aspired to create a system of discovery and dissemination which would push back the veil of ignorance and make possible a continuing surge of human progress. Progress has been made, that's rather obvious, but it's also obvious, as we know all too well, that progress has not been without its attendant difficulties. And witness the plight of the family farm and the family farmer, and our reason for being today. The purpose of this conference, and a primary reason for the program in religious studies at Iowa State University, is to bring the very best resources available at this university and other universities to bear on this profoundly difficult and important problem, the problem of the situation of the family farm and farmer. We're happy that you're here today. Over the next 2 days, you'll hear a variety of perspectives about the situation that's developing now for our family farm and farmers. You'll hear from a couple of economists who have slightly different views on certain issues, more profoundly different views on others that are relevant to this condition. You'll also hear later on Friday from 2 theologians. Neither paper have I read yet. I will this evening. I know one pretty well and can expect what will happen there, so I believe you'll find the theological perspectives presented on Friday afternoon and Friday evening very provocative and also very useful. They represent an attempt to bring a theoretical kind of consideration to bear on a concrete problem that's not very customary within an academic setting. Our procedure will go as follows. We'll run for approximately an hour and a half. Gary Comstock from the Department of Religious Studies will deliver our keynote address. Following his address, Lauren Soth will then make some comments, and after that we will have an opportunity for questions and comments and discussion back and forth with all of you here. I have some other announcements about the rest of the program that I'll make when we come to the conclusion of this first session today. Gary Comstock came to Iowa State from the University of Chicago just a few years ago. He finished his PhD there at the Divinity School about 3 or 4 years ago now, and he's been busy ever since he got on this campus. I don't think Gary ever had a chance to walk. He's been running. In addition to doing the usual duties that are associated with probationary life as an assistant professor, he got heavily engaged in forming what has now become a very important series in this university, and to this day he remains right in the center of that activity. He's a valued colleague at the university, he's a fine teacher, and he's developing for himself a rather prominent place in the life of the farmer within the state of Iowa and the Midwest, and we expect him to continue to be a leader. He brings ethics to bear in this issue in a rather unusual way. Most people in philosophy, certainly in my tradition, approach ethical matters in a very abstract and theoretical fashion. Gary's interests, while they include the theoretical dimension, ultimately cash in as practically oriented. He is, in the very best sense of the word, what I meant when I referred to the university in the land-grant tradition as an agent of social change. Gary is vitally interested in making a positive difference in the world around him via what he thinks he's learning and discovering in the area of religious ethics, and we're pleased to have him. The person who will be responding to Gary is personally a quite a treasure in the state of Iowa. Many of you may know Lawrence Soth. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer for the Des Moines Register. He writes columns regularly. He's one of those people who takes a very patient, very gentle, but nevertheless a very firm, hard, realistic look at what's going on in the life of the farmer and in the life of the state and beyond. I've always found his stuff in the Des Moines Register to be the kind of thing that one ought to require standard reading for everybody who has an interest in trying to make a positive difference in this part of our world. So we're very pleased to have him here as Gary's respondent. Now let me turn the program over to Gary Comstock.
Thanks, Dick. I don't know what you meant by saying that I've been running ever since I got on campus, but I was here at 2 minutes to 12 and realized that I'd forgotten my lecture back in my office in Ross Hall, so I have been running today. Don't tell my wife. She thinks I'm forgetful. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, or Chicago as we say it, so I can't really claim to be a farm boy. But like millions of other Americans in my generation, my grandparents were family farmers, genuine family farmers. And I happily spent the best summers of my life on their old home place, the Pippert Farm, 5 miles west of Norris Springs. A typical 160-acre operation on the north side of Route 18, the farm was given to my great-great-grandfather in 1880 in payment for his service in the Civil War. 4 generations of Pipperts have farmed that plot in Cerro Gordo County. But now my uncle Harold Pippert, like thousands of other farmers in his generation, stands in some danger of losing that century farm. How come? I ask myself. 2 possible answers come rushing at me from childhood. After a hard day of play in the barn, it was the grandchildren's custom to retire to the living room and listen to Grandpa tell stories, which he did very well. Of the many legends I remember hearing in that room, 2 stand out in my memory. Both were responses to the hard life of tilling soil. Now, the first I heard from a traveling salesman who happened to be bending my grandpa's ear in the living room. As the 2 men commiserated over the low price of corn, the dealer volunteered this little narrative. Well, yeah, it's just like they say. The banker gets the buck. I did not know then who the people were who so hated bankers. But a few years ago, I began reading of right-wing militant groups, blaming bankers for all the troubles down on the farm. Recently, as times have worsened in rural America, some people have taken to making scapegoats out of all farmers. These folk have formed themselves into loosely knit organizations, the party line of which is the same as my grandpa's salesman's. The banker gets the buck. Groups such as the following subscribe to this view: the Posse Comitatus, the Populist Party, Rick Elliott's group in Boulder, Colorado, the National Agricultural Press Association, the Order, the Aryan Nations, and Christian Identity. The title of our conference is meant to invoke their conspiracy theory, according to which the bankers, usually Jewish ones and always internationally connected, have taken over the Federal Reserve Board and our entire American economy. Working secretly, they are carrying out a dastardly scheme to steal farmland. The other story that sticks in my mind is my grandpa's. A man of few words, he quickly replied to this far-fetched tale with one of his own. "No, it ain't the banker I'm so worried about," he said. "It's the middleman." Now, I'm not certain what he meant, but it's reasonable to suppose that he had the following group in mind: retail grocers, meat packers, food processors, and grain handlers, all those in the middle, between the farmer and us, the consumers. My grandpa looked at the prices he received from the market for his cattle and corn, and then at the prices he had to pay for breakfast cereal and hamburger down at the Safeway, and he couldn't help but think that somebody in there was making out pretty good, and it sure warned him. Now notice my grandpa didn't have a conspiracy theory. He did not believe that a small group of evil-minded men was responsible for all his troubles. He did not think that a conspiracy of bankers, Jews, and Federal Reserve officials were carrying out a pre-established scheme to bilk him. What he did believe was that the system responsible for distributing rewards proportionate with effort did not seem to be working. The next 2 days of our conference are concerned with my grandpa's story. and not the conspiracy story of the salesman. The reason is that the salesman's conspiracy story has no basis in fact, as I will show. But there may be some reason to think that my grandpa's account is at least partially true. Deciding that question is one of the two central issues before us. The other and last issue I will talk about, and that we will talk about tomorrow, is one of values. It might appear that my grandfather's contention can be proven true or false simply on the basis of empirical data. To a certain extent, that's true. Whether the middle person is getting too big a piece of pie compared to what the farmer gets is a question calling for economic analysis. But if we think carefully about my grandpa's claim, we can see that he was not only concerned about empirical matters, but also with cultural and moral values. He thought a way of life was perishing in rural America, the way of life we call family farming, and he wanted to stop it. He was opposed to the idea that agriculture would become one more economic sector in which self-interest, profit-seeking, and greed would take over. Indeed, had he lived another 10 years, he might have had his worst fears confirmed. Along with the discussion of economics, we need to think then about cultural ideals and moral values, who we are and where we're going. That is something non-specialists like I and you can do. Indeed, we must do. But to help guide our reflections, we've invited two theologians to address us tomorrow. Both are Catholics. The choice of representatives from the same tradition is intentional. The Catholic Church's bishops have recently spoken out about the U.S. economy in general and the farm crisis in particular, and that's the reason for the choice. While past conferences here at Iowa State have shown clear differences between different religious traditions, tomorrow you will see that there are differences within a given tradition as well. What do we mean when we talk about a conspiracy against family farmers? It's important to be clear about this, as there are two very different theories. Many critics of the so-called agricultural establishment, sometimes also referred to as the USDA land grant system, do not have a conspiracy theory at all. Someone with a conspiracy theory wants you to believe four things. One, that there's a specific group that has, two, a secret plan, three, to benefit themselves, four, by defrauding others. Someone with a conspiracy theory wants you to think that there has been a carefully orchestrated series of events controlled by the master plan of a small group to put others out of business. This was the salesman's view. We must keep this view distinct from my grandpa's claim. He thought that random individuals who just happened to be at the right place at the right time were benefiting disproportionately from inside information and discrete acts of collusion. His explanation of the farm crisis would not rest with a specific race of evil-minded people, but rather with four different things. One, a political economic system that has, two, the open and public goal of rewarding competitive advantage. Three, to the benefit of any good-hearted soul who can luckily or skillfully master the system. Four, without hurting anybody else. I will call this the complicity theory. This, I take it, is the view my colleague Tony Smith had in mind when he, along with Catholic Bishop Maurice Dingman, asserted at last year's conference that the family farmer was being squeezed out of business by powerful oligopolies in the farm supply and the food manufacturing industries, the two economic sectors on either side of the farmer. Since we will be focusing primarily on this second theory, we should probably, maybe for the sake of honesty in advertising, change the name of the conference. It's not really a conference on is there a conspiracy against family farmers, but rather something like, does capitalism encourage collusion against family farmers? Does capitalism encourage collusion against family farmers? My paper has three parts. In the first, I recount and then criticize the right-wingers' conspiracy theory. In the second, I introduce the left-wingers' complicity theory. In the third, I argue for the relevance of religious ethics for questions in ag policy. This will take me about another 50 minutes, so I hope you can bear with me. Part one, the conspiracy theory. According to the right-wingers' conspiracy theory, an international brotherhood of Jewish bankers has taken control of the Federal Reserve Board and is secretly scheming to put Iowa farmers out of business. Now, anyone close to the current crisis knows the quiet pain and despair that many farm families now face. Anyone with the most remote connection to farming understands the stress, monetary, psychological, and spiritual, that fully 1/3 to 1/2 of our rural farmers suffer. You also know how easy it is to look for scapegoats at such a time. It is this all too human tendency that has given rise to militant leaders and extremist groups. But it must be said at the beginning and at the end that the views of these anti-Semitic conspiratorial movements are both mistaken and dangerous. To their credit, the media and others have said this over and over. Unfortunately, what we have not done is expose just what these groups believe, why they are wrong, and where they have important half-truths, along with vicious falsehoods, hidden in their rhetoric. In the next 10 minutes, I would like to provide such an analysis. The source of many of the ideas in the movements is this pamphlet written by Sheldon Emery, Billions for the Bankers, Debts for the People. It's filled with lots of cartoons of this little character that you might be able to see in the front row anyway, reclining in his chair, smoking a cigar with a little Van Dyke goatee, and burning money with the tip of his cigar. Looks like he's probably a banker. There's a sheaf of papers that say mortgage on his desk. That's the giveaway. In this booklet, we're told that bankers lending shirt-sleeved farmers like this guy on the tractor give the farmers $50,000 one year and then ask for $250,000 a few years later. As anyone who bought a house in 1983 knows, at 14% interest for 30 years, the borrower has to pay back $710.42 a month, or a total of $255,931.20 for her original $50,000 note. I know only too well because I bought a house in Ames in 1983. Emery denounces the whole idea, saying that these banks do not have $50,000 worth of assets when they write us the original check. They simply create it out of thin air. Whether it's a house owner or a farmer taking out the loan, we cannot do the same when it comes time to paying them back. When it comes time to pay back the loan with interest, we have to produce actual goods, not worth $50,000, but worth $250,000. We do this by getting a job at a university or giving lectures. And anyone who gives lectures knows that at that rate you'll never pay that back, unless you work in Washington, D.C. or something. In which case, the farmer has to raise real soybeans and corn in order to pay back his loan. The point is that the usury system inevitably works against us. The bankers risk nothing. They take their money from a magic bag. We risk everything. We have to pay with real goods and services. And we have to pay for 4 homes to get one, or raise 4 seasons of crops in order to get an operating loan for 1 season, according to Emery. Creating and lending money is very profitable. Knowing this, bankers decided a long time ago not to lend money merely to private citizens like you and I, but to companies and even to the United States government. Let me read to you just one brief section from the book. It's on page 6. In December of 1913, Congress, with many members away for the Christmas holidays, passed what has since been known as the Federal Reserve Act. This simple but terrible law completely removed from Congress the right to create money or to have any control over its creation, and gave that function to the Federal Reserve Corporation. The people were not told then, and most still do not know today, that the Federal Reserve Corporation is a private corporation controlled by bankers, and therefore is operated for the financial gain of the bankers over the people, rather than for the good of the people. The word federal, he adds, was used only to deceive us. Since that day of infamy, more disastrous to us than Pearl Harbor, the small group of privileged people who lend us our money have accrued to themselves all the profits of printing our money and more. Since 1913, they have created tens of billions of dollars, which, as their own personal property, they then lend to our government and our people at interest. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer has become the secret policy of our national government. It doesn't have to be this way, writes Emery. If our government would control and create all the money used in this country and lend it out at 0% interest, there would be no national debt and very little personal debt. Nice idea. But instead of a debt-free, peaceful, prosperous people, as we could be, we are instead ruled by bankers to whom we owe trillions of dollars. Who's to blame for this travesty? Was it Democrats or Republicans that got us into this mess? Significantly, Emory blames it on all political parties, calling them all dupes of the bankers. Indeed, the list of people who have not told you any of these simple truths takes up 2 pages at the back of the pamphlet. They have not told you in bold-faced type, and here's who has not told you. All presidents, all vice presidents, presidential candidates, cabinet members, U.S. judges, other appointed U.S. officials, every U.S. senator or representative except Robert La Follette, Charles Binderup, and Charles Lindbergh, Sr. State governors, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, other political parties, the League of Women Voters, Associated Press, UPI, Reuters, every large daily newspaper and newspaper columnist, ABC, NBC, CBS and Mutual, Time, Life, Newsweek, Look, U.S. News and World Report, and People magazine. It goes on, but you get the idea. All of these ruthless folk have conspired together, we are told, to cover up the grand scheme, knowing that, and I quote, "It is easier to control and rob an ill, poorly educated, and confused people than it is a healthy and intelligent population. So these conspirators deliberately favor drug use, alcohol, racial intermarriage, sexual promiscuity, abortion, pornography, and crime. We cannot say we were not warned. God Almighty, says Emory, told us in the Scriptures that," and then he quotes Deuteronomy 28, "the stranger that is within thee shall get up high above thee, very high, and thou shalt come down very low. And why? Because he shall lend to thee." Emory's anti-Semitic gloss on this biblical verse is no less offensive for being indirect. He says, "Most of the owners of the biggest banks in America are of Eastern European ancestry and connected with the Rothschild European banks." Here's a full-blooded conspiracy theory. Now, I want you to notice several things about it. First, it's true that the Bible has scores of passages condemning the robbery of the workers and the poor by the wicked. I will come back at the end of my lecture to the relevance of biblical and religious values. Second, it is true that large multinational corporations have wielded an extraordinary amount of power and influence over our lives, and especially of the lives of people in developing countries. Third, critics from both the right and the left have argued that we are losing diversity in, and perhaps democratic control over, parts of our agricultural economy. All of these points, in themselves more or less defensible, are made but then distorted by Emory. So why bother with this pamphlet at all? The answer is painfully obvious. It has only taken a few desperate people to take it to heart, to apply it to themselves, and to act in vicious ways toward others. It has influenced the formation of movements I mentioned earlier, like the Order and Christian Identity. Estimates place the number of activists in these groups at between 2,000 and 5,000 in the Great Plains and Midwest. And I'd like to thank Prairie Fire in Des Moines and the Center for Democratic Renewal in Atlanta, Georgia, for doing lots of work on these groups. This seems like a small number, 2,000 to 5,000 in the Midwest. But for each activist, there may be 7 to 10 sympathizers, giving us a total of between 14,000 and 50,000 people, whom, given a grim enough farm economy, might find themselves drawn closer and closer to this heterodoxy. Rather than dismiss the view with labels or treat it hysterically the way Geraldo Rivera did on his 2020 segment, it would behoove us to say out loud and in public what reasons there are for not believing the theory. There are many. Regarding the Jews in banking, figures show that in 1965, 45 of the 50 largest U.S. banks were not only not controlled by Jews, but didn't have a single Jew in upper management. 38 of the 50 had no Jews in middle management either. In 1979, in New York, supposedly the hotbed of Jewish banking, only 15 of 345 senior officials of the largest New York banks were Jewish, less than 5%. There are all sorts of facts of this kind showing that Jews don't control banks. I'm going to skip over them because I think you've got the point. Of course, there are some Jewish people in banking, like there are some Norwegians in religious studies. But Jews who happen to run banks have just as difficult a time as anyone else managing their own corporations. To suggest that they control their employees and that they control the employees of all other banks, plus the President of the United States, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the press corps, is to suggest that these fictional men have powers that the creators of Rambo and Batman did not presume to give their heroes. Just think what an extraordinary thing it would be were the conspiracy theory to be true. It's difficult for me to keep control over my own son, and he's only 2 years old. How could anyone's control extend not only to spouse, politicians, and administrators, but all the way through the upper echelons of government to the universities, the Lions Club, the churches, the Farm Bureau, and the Book of the Month Club? Reverend Emory and the right-wing theorists ask us to believe the impossible. There's nothing wrong with trying to find causal explanations for the farmers' plight, but we must not oversimplify the story. We blind ourselves to the real facts when we attribute the entire farm crisis to a handful of gluttonous bankers. The moral of this first part of my talk is that the salesman on my grandpa's farm and all of the right-wing extremist groups who believe conspiracy like his are simply wrong. And now if we can leave that theory buried on the right, I'd like to turn to the left and the second part of my paper. Everybody still awake? What about my grandpa's story? Does the middleman get the buck? There is nothing of the salesman's dark anti-Semitic metaphysics in my grandpa's complicity theory. Based on sober economic observations and historical claims, this view locates evil not in the human personalities of a few villains, but in the impersonal laws of a certain economic system. All who participate in monopoly capitalism are to one degree or another at fault. That means we're all partially to blame, and none of us is especially villainous nor saintly. This is a theology whose patron saint is Augustine, not Hitler. It sees a universal fault in all humans and in our corporate instincts. Let me remind you of the differences between the conspiracy and complicity theories. Conspiracy implies a specific group with a secret plan to benefit only members of their group by defrauding others. That's on this hand, my right hand. The complicity theorists believe that there's an economic system with the open goal of rewarding competitive advantage to the benefit of anyone who can master the system without harming anyone else. Conspiracy implies a carefully orchestrated series of events controlled by a handful of powerful men. Complicity implies an impersonal structural system in which random individuals engage in discrete acts of collusion. Here's how a complicity theorist might go about explaining why my uncle is in some danger of losing his family farm. Up on that beautiful little farm between Norris Springs and Mason City lives my grandpa, say, and his family. He, like all of his neighbors, is an independent farmer, living at least a mile from any of his buddies. Because of his independence and his geographical distance from others, it is not likely that he will join a union or form a strongly organized cooperative. As a result, he and his pals seem constitutionally incapable of banding together to influence the prices they must pay for their John Deere combines, Pioneer seed corn, and liquid nitrogen fertilizer. Similarly, it is not likely that they will be able to work cooperatively to determine the prices they receive in October for their corn and soybeans and cattle and hogs. The result is that each one must, in the slogan, buy retail and sell wholesale. None of them have leverage in bargaining. There are too many of them with corn to sell, and not enough buyers to play off against each other. The situation does look bleak. Eventually, the big giants on either side of my grandpa milk him dry, eat him up, and blow him away. That's what's been happening in the Corn Belt for the past 6 years, according to the complicity theory. There is evidence to suggest, in the words of my colleague Tony Smith, that the family farmer is caught in a competitive sector, farming, sandwiched between sectors of extremely concentrated and non-competitive economic power. Now we have the farmer in the middle. The story has changed a little bit. He's being squeezed out of business by the giants who feed him his farm inputs, tractors, pesticides, and seeds, and who buy his products from him, meat packers, grain elevators, and corn sweetener processors. The picture's a little bit different, but the story's the same. It's the people selling to and buying from the farmer who get rich, and not the farmer. Now, is there any evidence to suggest this story is true? Well, consider the concentration of companies in the farm input sector. The 4 largest companies selling tractor attachments accounted for 80% of sales in 1977. In the same year, the top 4 firms selling harvesting machinery, like combines and cotton pickers, had 79% of sales. The 8 largest companies selling nitrogen and phosphate fertilizers had 64% of total agricultural chemical sales. And the pesticides industry was similarly dominated by a handful of companies. 4 firms had 60% market share. Why do these facts seem to lend support to the collusionists' theory? Well, consider what happens when you can decrease the number of your competitors. Suppose you walk into this room with a bushel full of corn to sell, wanting to sell it for $3 a bushel.
I'll do that.
Are you going to have an easy time of it if there's no one else in the room selling corn and lots of other people in the room wanting some? Suppose there's 100 people in the room wanting to buy your corn, Lauren. If there's lots of potential buyers and you acting alone as a seller, you won't have a very hard time at all getting your price, will you? On the other hand, if you suddenly come into the gallery and 100 other people are lugging 100 bushels of corn each, you're in big trouble. You're going to have to bid against them in order to sell your product. Indeed, instead of getting your $3 a bushel, you might end up having to settle for $1 a bushel in order to unload it. If you're really strapped, you might end up giving the stuff away, promising to give the guy another bushel later on and carry them both to his truck for him. Who knows? This is elementary economics, I know, and I'm not an economist, but it is important. The law of supply and demand tells us that the more competitors there are, the lower, or the more competitive, the prices will be. With fewer competitors, prices go up. When there are only a few sellers in a market, we say that the sellers have oligopoly power. When there are only 3 of you selling corn, 2 of you along with Lauren, to, say, 100 buyers, you have oligopoly power. What do you do in that case? You don't try to underbid your competitors. There's no reason to. You already have people offering you twice the price you had in mind. Rather than competing against your so-called competitors, you would cooperate with them. Oh, so subtly, if there were laws against it, driving the price up and up and up to $3.50 or $4.50 or $39.95 maybe. Now, we would not accuse you of being involved in a conspiracy because you didn't come into this room with the intention of doing this. But you are, however subtly, cooperating, complying with your 2 supposed competitors. We call this collusion. Of course, in the real world, it's not my grandpa and his buddies who are allegedly in collusion, but rather, allegedly, the Beatrices and Nabiscos, the Cargills and Continentals, the IBPs and Swift slaughterhouses. They're the ones scratching each other's backs. Or so critics have charged. In a major sector of the food marketing economy, writes William Miller of the University of Iowa, 4 vast grain cartels manipulate prices in so many ways that farmers are knocked completely out of the supply and demand formula. Consider 1983, when the government's PIC program idled nearly half of all production acres. That same year, the Midwest was hit with its worst drought in a decade. Yet at year's end, prices were stable for corn and beans, and the USDA reported there was still a surplus on hand. How could that be? How could that be? The National Farmers Organization discovered that millions of metric tons of grain were imported by the grain cartels to create an artificial surplus that year. That year also marked the end for tens of thousands of farmers. Now, we often hear it said that these large grain cartels are justified on economic grounds like efficiency, competitiveness, and progressiveness. They are efficient. Large international conglomerates can handle huge amounts of grain and achieve high economies of scale. And they are pretty good at competing against stiffening international competition. But there are problems too. When a few buyers can each exert a disproportionate amount of influence on a market, the result is that prices for sellers, for farmers, are kept artificially low. This may be the case in the real world. Farmers find themselves in a room with 100 other farmers selling hogs to 3 or 4 agribusiness firms. Those firms have oligopsony power. And the first problem that appears to us is that we no longer have a free market. Now, we hear lots of talk these days about returning agriculture to the so-called free market. But the concentration of firms in some parts of the agricultural economy makes a mockery of that talk. Why? Because conglomerates can make it very difficult for new competitors to enter their sector, and they can successfully resist organizing by farmers who wish to form cooperatives. When Cargill can buy corn as easily from Argentina or Australia as from Mason City or Norris Springs, it simply won't help for my grandpa to think that he can resist Cargill simply by refusing to grow or sell grain to them. Cargill can get corn wherever it darn well pleases. Here's another worry. These conglomerates can operate secretly, above public scrutiny. There have been very few public debates about the issue I have just raised. Before this conference, one of the few occasions was in June of 1976, when Senator Frank Church, a Democrat from Idaho, chaired the Senate subcommittee hearings on multinational corporations. Commenting on the secretive nature of the major participants in food manufacturing, Senator Church said, "No one knows how they operate. No one knows what their profits are. No one knows what they pay in taxes and what effect they have on our foreign policy, or much of anything else about them." Fourth worry is that the effect of multinational corporations on developing countries, third world countries, can be devastating. When we ask developing countries to provide us with cheap labor in exchange for bringing them into the international market, we almost always destroy their indigenous food system. When these countries begin growing food for the world market, instead of for their own sustenance, tragic situations can result. For instance, at the height of its famine in the early 1980s, Ethiopia was exporting grain. At the height of its famine in the early 1980s, Ethiopia was exporting grain. Those who buy my uncle's corn may have too much influence over the market, and there may be similar problems in other areas. In Iowa, there are only a handful of companies buying cattle and hogs for slaughter. They are led by IBP, Iowa Beef Packing Company, Excel, and Swift. Studies by Professor Bruce Marion have shown that in our region of the country, there are relatively high and increasing levels of concentration in the procurement of live cattle and the sale of boxed beef. Deterioration of competitive forces may be occurring. Feeders like my uncle, in some areas, may be receiving lower prices for the cattle than they would in more competitive markets. The economist's language is cautious and tentative. That's the way we scholars talk. But do not let our rhetoric hide what we are saying. As IBP has increased its market share, not only have they hurt the farmers from whom they buy by artificially depressing prices, they have also been able to take advantage of employees who work for them. A world of grief for Hispanic and low-income Iowans is packed into Marion's terse comment that, and I quote, "Hourly employees have seen many jobs eliminated and their wages and fringes reduced substantially." As Marion oh so carefully puts it, some meat packers in Iowa have been criticized for encouraging rapid turnover of employees and recruiting immigrants and foreign nationals willing to work for lower wages. If you can get people to quit, you can hire new people at lower entry-level wages. When workers see what is happening and form unions in order to fight it, what may a company do? It might shut down the plant, telling the press that the plant is inefficient and old-fashioned, fire its workers, move a few miles down the road and open a new plant. They might then hire non-unionized employees at substantially lower wages, with substantially fewer fringe benefits than the old line packers. If there's a possibility that such action may be illegal, they may take the additional step of changing their corporate name so that they reopen the plant under separate ownership. Now, the counter-argument to all of this is that the plants are progressive and adaptable, and the corporations that own them have made cheap food available to Americans in all classes. What these firms make in profits will either benefit the rest of us immediately, or at worst, trickle down to consumers and farmers eventually. A study by Russell Parker and John Connor, however, suggests that the trickle-down theory may not be all it's cranked up to be. They found that consumers in 1974 paid $12 to $14 billion in overcharges due to oligopolies in the food manufacturing industries. $12 billion. The trickle-down theory in agriculture may not be any more believable to us than it was to President Reagan's budget director. I have two related worries about modern agriculture. The first concerns agribusiness corporations. As farming becomes increasingly specialized, corporations are realizing that the more control they have over each stage of the growing and marketing process, the better off they are. So conglomerate firms are buying not only seed companies and slaughterhouses, but petrochemical companies as well. You should know that IBP, which most recently was in the news for canceling the insurance of its striking employees and for allegedly covering up health and safety violations at its Dakota City, Nebraska plant, IBP is owned by Occidental Petroleum. Excel is owned by, you guessed it, Cargill. Vertical integration, writes Luther Tweeten, is apparent in agricultural biotechnology. Conglomerate firms with direct agricultural applications are purchasing biotech firms frequently located in university communities. In 1984, Lubrizol Corporation, specializing in oil additives, purchased AgriGenetics Corporation, which had already bought up 12 seed companies and was the 7th largest producer of seed. This is a Boulder, Colorado firm, AgriGenetics, specializing in biotech to improve crops. 5 years earlier, Lubrizol purchased a 25% share in GeneTech, another biotech firm. In '82, they had already bought 28% equity in SunGene Technology and Sigco Research, a sunflower company, and Linville Seed Company, soybean company. Such vertically integrated agribusinesses are not having to go it alone either. Land-grant universities, like Iowa State, are currently falling over themselves to do research for them. For example, a problem faced by hybrid seed companies is how to protect their patents. In the past, Pioneer has had problems with competitors stealing their varieties by introducing Pioneer's own genes into the rival firm's gene pool. Should one of these conglomerate companies discover the miracle seed everyone's shooting for, the company wants to be sure it can protect its investment by being able to identify its product. One way to do this is secretly to mark one of the genes in the seed. In order to do this, however, basic research is needed in biochemistry. Are AgriGenetics and Calgene and Monsanto doing that research? You bet they are, and they should be. Is Iowa State? Yes. Recently, our school received a $160,000 grant to study this problem. Was the money contributed by industry? No, it came from your pockets. At a time when the water in northeastern Iowa is almost undrinkable because of contaminants, we are spending money on ways to protect the profitability of seed companies vertically integrated with pesticide and herbicide companies. Is there any evidence to suggest that the left-wing complicity theory is true? There sure is, and that's why we're devoting the next 2 days to consideration of the topic. Empirical matters like the ones I have just raised are important and relevant, and I don't claim to have decided the matters. Today, Professors Marion and Tweeten will address them. But even more urgent, I think, is the question of values. What virtues and vices does our present agricultural system encourage? What habits of mind and traits of character does it promote? Modern food marketing spends billions of dollars each year on differentiating Coke from Pepsi and on advertising the virtues of Kellogg's Raisin Bran over General Mills' brand. What does this tell us about ourselves? Are these the kinds of goals and activities we want to be spending our money on? Or does modern agricultural marketing play upon and stimulate our worst instincts? Greed, self-interest, and one-upmanship. These are not questions for economists, but for us, properly informed citizens. Questions of morality and cultural identity are questions that you and I are called upon to answer. In guiding our reflections, however, it is helpful to have the aid of philosophers and ethicists and theologians. Now, I'm finally on my last part of the paper. This is about 5 minutes long, and if you'll bear with me, I'll be done in 10 minutes.
You're on.
Catholic theology and economic justice. There are several different attitudes toward our current economic system among Christian theologians. I will introduce just two. I'll call them, for lack of better terms, the conservative and liberal views. And if you want, you can, well, no. The conservative Catholic tends to emphasize these values: liberty, democracy, private property, and individual responsibility. The liberal tends to emphasize these: justice, democracy, the common good, and social responsibility. All of these values are good. In theory, there need be no conflict between the conservative and the liberal. In practice, there's usually a good deal. For example, let me contrast the positions taken by two individuals identifying themselves as Christians at last year's conference. Consider first the views of Merrill Oster, a publisher of magazines and journals geared toward large farmers and agribusinesses. Oster said that farming is a risky business, and farmers should just take responsibility for their gains or losses. We are all in an economic race, and those who have the pedal to the metal must pay the price when things take a sharp, unexpected turn. As Christians and citizens of a free enterprise market economy, he said, we must admit that we are responsible for our own risk decisions.